Imagine that tomorrow you could no longer work, not because you didn't want to, simply because you couldn't. Who would you be? Would your value as a human being remain exactly the same? Since I joined the corporate world as a junior software developer, I couldn't shake that feeling that something wasn't quite right. At first, I thought the problem was simply that I wasn't used to office life. But over the years, I began to realize that what I had experienced wasn't just a personal struggle. It pointed to something much deeper about the way modern work is organized. The first thing that struck me was the amount of time I had to spend without any significant physical activity. I am naturally a person who loves to move, so sitting in front of a computer for long, uninterrupted periods was something I really had to work through. And it was not an easy process. Now, I know many of you might say that I should have known what I was getting myself into from the beginning. After all, programming is a static job in that sense. And I should have factored that into my decision to become a software developer. And you would be right. In fact, I did take that into account. What surprised me wasn't the nature of the job itself, but how difficult it was to adapt to this new way of living. It simply did not come naturally to me to sit in a chair for hours every day in front of a computer. I know there are people who can do that because programming is their passion, and for them it comes much easier. But even then, I think there is a limit that should not be crossed if you want to pursue or preserve our health, both physical and mental. We need movement far more than our workplaces seem to allow. And this was only one of the first things that made me think there was something fundamentally wrong with the way many corporations operate. The second thing I started to notice was the anxiety I experienced while working in an open space environment. The idea behind open space offices is understandable. They are meant to facilitate teamwork, communication, and collaboration. This is what we are told, and I think there is some truth to that. Sometimes that is necessary, and therefore good. The problem appears when there is no interruption, no place to retreat, and no space for privacy. And people need privacy. I noticed that some of my best work was done when I was alone in the comfort of my own home, where I could focus entirely on the problem I was trying to solve, without constantly being aware of the people around me. Intellectual work requires concentration, and concentration requires silence. A surprising amount of mental energy is spent simply navigating these social expectations that people put on you, even when nobody is speaking to you. There is also a natural ceiling to how much deep intellectual work a human being can perform in a single day. For most people, somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of genuine deep work is already a tremendous achievement. After that, your mind simply becomes exhausted. Sometimes you become so mentally drained that even formulating a coherent sentence becomes difficult. I say that from personal experience. And yet, you are expected to remain at your desk for another 2 or 3 hours. So what happens? Often you stop producing meaningful work and begin producing the appearance of work. You stare at the screen, you switch between windows, you make sure you look busy because you know people can see you. The irony is that everyone else is often doing exactly the same thing. This slowly creates a false way of living where appearance becomes more important than reality. Instead of asking whether meaningful work is being accomplished, the question becomes whether everyone looks productive. That environment slowly becomes toxic, not because people are dishonest by nature, but because the system quietly encourages that kind of behavior. There is a great deal of psychology behind the way modern workplaces are designed. Offices were not always built this way. There was a time when many employees had individual offices where they could think, reflect, and work without constant interruption. That changed, and I don't think it changed by accident. The modern office often seems designed to maximize visibility rather than concentration, because visibility creates the feeling that one must always be producing. The priority is shareholder value. Rarely is the primary concern the well-being of the human being who spends most of his waking life inside that environment. I think there are at least two simple changes that could significantly improve the quality of life for knowledge workers. First, give people more privacy. Design offices so that people actually have spaces where they can perform deep work without constant interruption. Second, We should seriously reconsider how many hours knowledge workers are expected to work. Cognitive labor is fundamentally different from physical labor. The brain becomes exhausted long before the clock reaches the end of the workday. Now, that is not to say that people doing physical labor don't get exhausted. They do. It's just that I do not have enough experience to talk about this, but I have a suspicion they would benefit from reduced working hours as well. These would be small steps, but they would be steps toward respecting the dignity of what it means to be human. The third thing that made me uneasy was the never-ending sense of urgency. Everything is urgent. Everything is burning. Everything has to be done immediately. There is very little room left for deep thinking. Execution becomes the supreme virtue. We must constantly produce because otherwise it feels as though the entire system will collapse. Now, don't get me wrong. There are situations where urgency is entirely justified, but over time I begin to realize that much of this urgency is manufactured. It is created out of thin air, and then a question naturally arises. Why? Why create a constant pressure when no real emergency exists? Again, I think the answer points to something deeper. We have forgotten patience. Patience has become almost a foreign concept in our society. We want everything immediately because we have become accustomed to living in what I would call the eternal present. If I cannot have it now, then somehow I feel that I am losing something. This mindset eventually reaches the workplace, where every task becomes urgent simply because nobody wants to wait. Another thing I noticed was the lack of freedom. More specifically, the amount of time I was allowed to have for myself each year. You work the entire year under constant pressure, solving difficult problems, carrying responsibilities, meeting deadlines, and at the end you receive only a few weeks that truly belong to you. And that is, if you are healthy enough to enjoy them. The imbalance between the amount of work we perform and the amount of time we have for our families, our friends, our hobbies, and simply for being human is, I think, another symptom of something much deeper. By this point, it became clear to me that my critique was no longer really about corporations. The corporate world is simply one manifestation of a larger cultural problem. We increasingly treat human beings as instruments, as economic units, as resources and assets. Our value slowly becomes measured by our own productivity. We are valuable insofar as we produce. If we stop producing, we begin to feel that we ourselves have become useless. But that is a profoundly distorted understanding of what a human being is. It cannot depend on productivity charts, it cannot depend on economic outputs, because if it does, then our humanity itself becomes a commodity. I remember a discussion I had once with a friend about this. We were talking about taking some time off and about the importance of having time for yourself. We both agreed that it is necessary, but then I remember him saying something that really stayed with me. He said that taking time off is important because afterwards you can come back and produce even more. Now, there is certainly some truth to that. Rest can indeed make us more productive, but what struck me was that we seem unable to justify free time without immediately turning it into a tool for future production. It's as if rest has lost its value in itself and now only receives value because it eventually helps us work harder. I think that way of thinking reveals the problem about the culture we live in. Having time for yourself is not simply a strategy to become more productive later. It is a genuine human need. It is a good in itself. Of course, becoming more productive afterwards can be one of its consequences, but I don't think it should become the primary justification. As you have probably noticed by now, this video is not primarily a critique of the corporate world, although it certainly includes one. It is a critique of the deeper assumptions that shape our entire socio-economic system. When a civilization places material wealth above spiritual wealth, it should not surprise us that work also becomes primarily ordered toward production instead of the flourishing of the human person. Eventually, we begin to reap what we have sown. We create an anti-human work culture not because anyone consciously desires it, but because the system naturally moves toward maximizing material wealth while neglecting spiritual wealth. I believe a healthier society would understand work differently. Work is necessary, work is good, Work gives meaning, but work should still leave room for contemplation, for reflection, privacy, artistic expression, for family, and perhaps most importantly, for God. Because ultimately, I think our alienation from God has also led to our alienation from ourselves. Once God is removed from the top of our hierarchy of values, something else inevitably takes his place. Usually money, success, status, or productivity in this case. But none of these things were ever meant to define who you are. If we begin once again to order our lives properly, placing God at the highest point and everything else beneath him, then perhaps we can slowly begin to rebuild not only healthier workplaces but healthier human beings. Because before we ask what kind of workers we want to become, we should first ask a much more important question. What does it truly mean to be human? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.